Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into an instructive game between OngoleBull and their opponent, both rated around 1580. We're going to break down the opening phase, highlight the key moments, and make sure you come away with some practical lessons for your own games. Let's jump right in. White kicks things off with e4. Black responds with c6, signaling the Caro-Kann defense. White plays d4, grabbing the center. Black answers with d5. So far, this is classic Caro-Kann territory. The key idea here for both sides is to fight for central control and develop pieces efficiently. White wants to build a strong pawn center, while black aims to challenge it and develop solidly. Now, white pushes e5. This is the advance variation, where white gains space and restricts black's central pawn breaks. The main plan for white is to support the center and develop behind the pawns, while black will look for ways to undermine that structure. Black develops the bishop to f5. White brings out the knight to f3. Black plays e6, reinforcing the d5 pawn and preparing to develop the kingside. White develops the other knight to c3. Black plays knight d7. All of these moves are pretty standard. Both sides are following opening principles: develop pieces, control the center, and prepare to castle. Here's our first critical moment. White plays bishop g5, pinning the knight. But this actually lets the evaluation swing in black's favor by about half a pawn. Why is that? The key idea here is that white misses a more active plan. Instead of bishop g5, playing bishop d3 would have immediately challenged black's strong bishop on f5 and helped white complete development. By pinning the knight, white isn't threatening much, and black can easily unpin later. The learning point: in the Advance Caro-Kann, prioritize developing your pieces to active squares and don't rush to pin unless it creates real pressure. Black responds with queen b6, putting pressure on b2 and eyeing the queenside. White plays rook b1, defending b2. Black plays knight e7, rerouting the knight, possibly to f5 or c6. White now plays bishop d3, finally challenging the f5 bishop. Black captures. Bishop takes d3. White recaptures with queen takes d3. Let's pause here for a second. After this exchange, the position is still balanced, but white's queen is a bit exposed on d3, and black has slightly easier development. The key takeaway: when you recapture with the queen early, always be mindful of potential tempo gaining moves by your opponent. Black plays a6. This is actually a missed opportunity. Black could have played c5 right away, striking at the center and putting white under immediate pressure. The reason c5 is stronger is that it challenges white's central pawn chain before white has time to consolidate. If you're playing the Caro-Kann as black, remember, timely pawn breaks are essential to avoid getting squeezed. White castles kingside, getting the king safe. Black now plays c5, finally challenging the center. White captures. D takes c5. But this is another instructive moment. White misses a better move here, knight a4. By playing knight a4, white could have attacked black's queen on b6 and forced it to retreat, gaining a tempo and keeping central tension. Capturing on c5 lets black recapture with the knight and develop smoothly. The lesson: in these positions, look for ways to attack your opponent's active pieces and don't rush to resolve the central tension unless it's clearly in your favor. Black plays knight takes c5, recapturing the pawn and bringing the knight to a great square. White retreats the queen to d1. Black develops the other knight to c6. But here, black misses a chance to play knight d7, which would have kept more control over the center and prepared for possible pawn breaks. The key idea: when you have a choice between developing a piece to an active square or a more defensive one, always consider what your opponent's next threat might be. Now, white plays bishop e3, bringing the bishop to a central square and connecting the rooks. This is a solid, natural move, nothing flashy, but it keeps development smooth and prepares for potential central action. Black responds with queen c7, tucking the queen away from any discovered attacks and keeping an eye on the c-file. Again, both sides are just improving their pieces and waiting for the right moment to strike. White brings the rook to e1. This is a classic middle game plan. Centralize your rooks, especially on open or semi-open files. The e-file could become important if the center opens up. Black develops the bishop to e7, finally preparing to castle. Both sides have completed development, and now the real middle game battle begins. Here's a critical moment. White plays bishop takes c5, capturing the knight on c5. At first glance, this looks tempting. You're grabbing a piece and removing a defender. But the evaluation drops by about half a pawn here. Why? The key idea is that by taking on c5, white gives up the bishop pair and helps black recapture with the bishop, activating it on a nice diagonal. Even more, the engine suggests knight e2 would have been better, keeping tension and preparing to reposition the knight to more active squares. The lesson: don't rush to trade pieces unless you're sure it improves your position. Sometimes, keeping the tension is stronger. Black recaptures with bishop takes c5. Now both sides have a minor piece imbalance. White has an extra knight, black has an extra bishop. This can shape the character of the game. Bishops are generally better in open positions, while knights thrive in closed ones. White plays a3, a quiet move, possibly preparing b4 to kick the bishop or expand on the queenside. But notice, the evaluation dips a bit here. The position calls for more active play. White could have considered moves like rook e2, doubling rooks or defending the c2 pawn more directly. The key takeaway: in the middle game, always look for ways to improve your most passive pieces or contest open files. Black castles kingside, finally getting the king safe and connecting the rooks. This is a standard move, but it also signals that black is ready to start playing on the open files. Now, white pushes b4. This is a critical moment. The evaluation drops by more than half a pawn. What's the issue? By playing b4, white weakens the c3 and c4 squares and overextends a bit. The better move would have been rook e2, defending the second rank and keeping flexibility. The key idea here: before pushing pawns, especially on the queenside, make sure you're not creating new weaknesses that your opponent can target. Black retreats the bishop to a7, keeping it on the long diagonal and eyeing the queenside. This is a nice, patient move. Sometimes, just preserving your bishop pair is enough to keep the pressure on. Here's a huge turning point. White plays knight g5, and the evaluation swings by almost 2 pawns. Let's break down why this is so problematic. By moving the knight to g5, white is hoping for some kingside play, but there's no real threat. Black's king is safe, and the knight is just out of play. The better move here was queen d3, centralizing the queen and keeping an eye on both flanks. The key lesson: don't launch an attack unless you have enough pieces to back it up. Otherwise, your pieces can end up stranded and out of position. Black responds with h6, kicking the knight. But even here, black misses a stronger move. Knight takes e5. By playing knight takes e5, black could have grabbed a central pawn and opened up the position for the bishops. The takeaway: when you see a piece out of place, always look for tactical shots, especially captures in the center. White retreats the knight to f3. This is forced, but now white has lost time and the initiative. Black plays rook ac8, bringing the rook to the open c-file. However, the engine points out that knight takes b4 would have been even stronger, grabbing a pawn and creating a passed pawn on the queenside. The key idea: when you have a chance to win material without risk, go for it. Always count captures and check if your opponent has enough compensation. White plays knight a4, trying to reposition the knight and maybe target the c5 bishop or the b6 square. But the position is already tough. White is running out of active plans. Black reroutes the knight to e7, preparing to bring it to more active squares like f5 or g6. This is a flexible move, keeping options open. White jumps back in with knight c5, attacking the bishop on a7 and trying to stir up some counterplay. But the bishop is not really in danger, and white's pieces are a bit scattered. Black captures. Bishop takes c5. Now black is up the bishop pair and has a clear advantage. Bishops are going to dominate in this open position. White recaptures with b takes c5. The queenside is opening up, but black's pieces are much better placed to take advantage. Black plays queen takes c5, grabbing a pawn and increasing the pressure. But there was an even stronger move here. Rook b8, doubling rooks on the b-file and threatening b2. The key idea: when you're ahead, look for ways to activate all your pieces and coordinate threats. Don't rush to take pawns if you can create bigger problems for your opponent. White snags a pawn with rook takes b7. This is a nice practical try. When you're down, grab what you can and hope for counterplay. Black plays knight g6, bringing the knight to a more active square. But again, rook b8 would have been even stronger, putting immediate pressure on white's rook and the b2 pawn. The learning point: when you have a strong open file, use it. Rooks are most powerful on open lines. White plays h3, a quiet move, but here the evaluation drops by more than a pawn. White misses the chance to play rook e3, defending the c3 knight and preparing to double rooks. The key idea: when you're under pressure, look for active defense, try to coordinate your pieces and cover your weaknesses. Black finishes this phase with queen takes a3, grabbing another pawn and cementing the advantage. Black is now up material and has a clear path to victory. Now, white goes for rook e3. This rook lift looks active, but let's pause. This is actually a big turning point, with the evaluation dropping by over 2.5 pawns. Why is this move so problematic? The key idea here is that white is trying to double up on the third rank, but it leaves the rook vulnerable to tactics. Black can immediately challenge the rook and force trades that favor them. Instead, a better move would have been to play queen d3, centralizing the queen and keeping more pieces on the board. The lesson: before making an aggressive rook move, always check if your opponent can immediately contest that file or rank and force unfavorable exchanges. Black responds with rook c3, instantly challenging the rook and threatening to swap off one of white's most active pieces. This is a classic example of seizing the initiative. When your opponent puts a piece on an open file or rank, contest it right away. White has to capture. Rook takes c3. There's not much choice here, but now white's losing control of the open files, and black's queen is about to become a monster. Black recaptures with queen takes c3. Now black's queen is super active, and white's remaining pieces are a bit awkward. The queen on c3 eyes both flanks and is ready to support a passed pawn or invade the kingside. White plays queen d3, trying to trade queens. This is a defensive move, hoping to simplify and maybe hold the endgame. But here's the thing: when you're down material or positionally worse, trading queens often just makes your defensive task harder, unless you have a fortress. Black accepts the trade with queen takes d3. This is a critical moment, as the evaluation jumps by over 2 pawns. Why is this so strong for black? The key idea: after the queen trade, black's extra pawn becomes more valuable in the endgame, and white's remaining pieces are not coordinated enough to create threats. Instead, white could have tried to keep queens on and look for perpetual check ideas. The lesson: don't rush to trade queens when you're worse. Sometimes, keeping pieces on the board gives you more chances for counterplay. White recaptures with c takes d3. Now we're in a pure endgame, and black's extra pawn is the main imbalance. Black plays rook a8, swinging the rook to the open a file. This is a textbook endgame plan. Activate your rook and look for targets on the queenside. White brings the rook to b4, trying to get active and maybe challenge black's queenside pawns. This is the right idea. When you're down material, you need to maximize your rook's activity. Black pushes a5, gaining space and fixing the a-pawn as a potential passed pawn. This is a classic endgame theme. Create a passed pawn on the flank to distract your opponent's pieces. White swings the rook to a4, eyeing the a5 pawn and trying to stay active. But black's pieces are still better coordinated. Black reroutes the knight to e7, heading for more active squares and keeping options open. This flexibility is key in the endgame. Don't rush, improve your worst piece. White brings the knight to d4, centralizing and hoping to blockade black's pawns. This is a good defensive try. Knights are great blockaders in the endgame. Black pushes g5, gaining space on the kingside. This is a slight inaccuracy. Engine says it gives white a little hope. The better move would have been to bring the king closer with king g6, centralizing and preparing to support the pawns. The key idea: in the endgame, activate your king as soon as possible. White plays g3, a waiting move, but it doesn't change much. White is hoping to hold the kingside together. Black brings the king up to g7, stepping closer to the action. Again, king g6 would have been more precise, immediately supporting the kingside pawns and threatening to invade. The lesson: don't be afraid to use your king as an attacking piece in the endgame. White brings the king to f1, starting the long march toward the center. This is a standard endgame plan, but it's a bit slow. Black continues with king g6, finally centralizing the king and preparing to support the pawn push. White pushes g4, but here's a big moment. The evaluation drops by almost a full pawn. The better move was king e2, bringing the king closer to the center and supporting the pawns. The key idea. In endgames, king activity is everything. Pawn pushes should only be played when they actually create threats or fix weaknesses. The learning point. Always prioritize king activity before committing your pawns. Black responds with h5, but this is a slight miss. The engine prefers king h7, keeping the king flexible and ready to support either side. The lesson. In endgames, sometimes waiting moves with the king are stronger than immediate pawn pushes. They keep your options open. Now white finally plays king e2, but it's a move late. The king is a bit out of play, and black's kingside pawns are ready to roll. Black captures h takes g4. This increases black's advantage, but again, king h6 would have been even stronger, keeping the king active and supporting the passed pawn. The key idea. Don't rush pawn trades. Sometimes, improving your king first is the best plan. White recaptures h takes g4. The kingside is opening up, but white's king is still too far away to help. Black brings the king back to g7, keeping control and preparing to support the pawns. White starts this phase with king e3, bringing the king toward the center. The key idea here is to activate your king in the endgame. Always a good principle. But here's the thing. After this move, black's advantage jumps to nearly 2 pawns. Why? Because white's king is a bit exposed, and black's extra pawn is ready to become a real problem. The takeaway. In endgames, king activity is crucial, but always double-check if your king is stepping into tactical shots or if your opponent can create a passed pawn quickly. Black responds with king f8. Now, this is a subtle moment. Black misses a chance to increase the pressure. The better move was king h6, bringing the king closer to the kingside pawns and supporting a potential g4 push. By playing king f8, black keeps the king a bit passive, and the evaluation drops by almost a pawn. The lesson. In endgames, don't be shy about activating your king aggressively, especially when you have an extra pawn. White plays knight f3, rerouting the knight to more active squares. This is a solid move, keeping an eye on key's central and kingside squares. Black brings the knight to c6, aiming for activity and maybe looking to support the queenside pawns. The position is still tense, but black's advantage is slipping away. White pushes d4, grabbing space in the center and opening lines for the king and knight. This is a nice strategic idea, centralizing your pawns and making your pieces more active. Black plays knight b4. Here's a critical moment. The evaluation drops sharply. The better move was king g7, centralizing the king and preparing to support the pawns. By playing knight b4, black chases ghosts on the queenside and loses the chance to dominate the kingside. The key takeaway. In endgames, prioritize king activity over minor piece maneuvers, unless you're creating a direct threat. White finds knight takes g5, snapping off the kingside pawn. This is a great tactical shot. White spots that the knight is safe and grabs material. The lesson. Always be on the lookout for loose pawns in the endgame, especially when your opponent's pieces are far away. Black brings the knight back to c6, trying to regroup. The position is now almost equal. White's activity has paid off. White plays knight h7 check, checking the king. This is a nice way to force the king to a less active square and keep the initiative. Black moves king g7, stepping away from the center. White brings the knight to f6, keeping the pressure on black's position and eyeing key squares. Black plays rook b8, activating the rook and putting pressure on the b-file. This is a standard endgame plan. Rooks belong on open files. Now, white plays knight d7, but this is a significant moment. The evaluation drops by over a pawn. The better move was f4, immediately pushing the kingside majority and creating threats. By playing knight d7, white's knight gets a bit offside and loses momentum. The key idea. When you have the chance to create a passed pawn or open lines for your pieces, don't hesitate. The learning point. In the endgame, pawn pushes that create threats are often stronger than piece maneuvers. Black responds with rook b4, doubling down on the b-file. But here's another missed opportunity. The best move is rook b3 check, checking the king and forcing it away from the center. The lesson: in rook and knight endgames, checks can be powerful tools to force your opponent's king into passive positions. Always look for forcing moves. White captures with rook takes b4, and black recaptures knight takes b4. We get a pure knight endgame with balanced material. White plays knight c5, centralizing the knight and eyeing both sides of the board. This is a textbook endgame maneuver. Knights are most powerful in the center. Black brings the king to g6, finally activating it and preparing to support the pawns. White pushes f4, starting to create a passed pawn and open lines for the king and knight. This is the right idea. Use your pawn majority. Black plays knight c2 check, checking the king. White steps to king d3, keeping the king active and in the center. Black checks again with knight b4 check, trying to harass the king and maybe pick up a pawn. White calmly plays king c3, keeping the king on the queen side and supporting the pawns. Black brings the knight back to c6, keeping the tension. White starts this phase with knight b3, rerouting the knight from c5 to b3. The key idea here is to reposition the knight to support the queenside pawns and maybe block black's knight from causing trouble. In endgames, knight maneuvering is all about finding those key outposts and supporting your pawn structure. Black responds with f6. This is a subtle but important moment. The evaluation ticks up just a bit for black, but let's talk about why. By playing f6, black is trying to activate the king and open up the kingside. The plan is to trade off pawns and create a path for the king to invade. The lesson here: in knight endgames, pawn breaks like f6 are often necessary to make progress, but you have to be careful. Every pawn trade changes the character of the position. White replies with e takes f6, capturing the pawn. This is the most principled response. When your opponent offers a pawn trade in the endgame, you usually want to take it, especially if it opens lines for your king or knight. Now white is temporarily up a pawn, but black's king is about to become very active. Black recaptures with king takes f6. Notice how black's king is now perfectly centralized and ready to support the remaining pawns. This is a textbook example of why king activity is so important in the endgame. If you ever have a choice between a passive king and an active one, always go for activity. White brings the knight back to c5. This is a solid, flexible move, keeping an eye on both the queenside and the center. The position remains balanced, but both sides are looking for ways to create a passed pawn. Black plays knight b4, jumping the knight to an aggressive square. Here's a teaching moment. Knights on the rim are usually dim, but in endgames, they can sometimes attack weak pawns or support a pawn push. In this case, black is eyeing the d5 square and maybe looking to harass white's king. White responds with king b3, bringing the king closer to the action on the queenside. This is a standard endgame plan: centralize your king and support your pawns. Black retreats the knight to c6, keeping the tension and staying flexible. Both players are maneuvering, looking for a breakthrough. White plays knight d7 check, giving a check. This is a critical moment. The evaluation dips a bit for white here. Let's break it down. By checking with knight d7 check, white forces the king to e7, but the knight is now a little awkward. The better plan was to keep the knight on c5, maintaining control of key squares and keeping pressure on black's pawns. The learning point: in knight endgames, sometimes it's better to keep the tension and not rush with checks unless you have a clear follow-up. Black steps to king e7, centralizing the king and keeping it active. This is exactly what you want in the endgame. Your king should always be a fighting piece, not just a bystander. White brings the knight back to c5. This is a bit of a repetition, and it shows how tricky these knight endgames can be. Both sides are probing for weaknesses but not finding a clear path forward. Black plays knight b4, again jumping to the rim. The position remains balanced, but both players are still searching for that critical breakthrough. So, what can we learn from this phase? The key ideas are: activate your king, use your knight flexibly, and be patient in the endgame. Don't rush with checks unless you have a concrete plan, and always look for pawn breaks that open up paths for your king. Knight endgames are all about maneuvering and timing. One slip can tip the balance. Thanks for following along with this endgame battle. If you enjoyed this analysis, be sure to like and subscribe to OngoleBull's Chess Journey YouTube channel. These deep breakdowns are designed to help you spot critical moments, avoid common mistakes, and ultimately boost your chess elo. So hit that subscribe button and keep improving your game. See you in the next one.